Without any further ado, we'll just get started on today's presentation on credentialing. It's obviously a complicated and takes time and experience to do it right. In this presentation, our panelists will explain payer credentialing services to help medical offices get set up quickly and correctly so you can spend time with patients and get paid for the work that you do. The key objective is to determine effective steps to gather necessary credentialing data from physicians as they join the practice, list affordable options for physician practices to effectively manage credentialing data, and create sustainable workflows and staffing resources for the ongoing maintenance and management of physician credentialing information. We'll also have some Q&A at the end for some of the other hot issues, especially the new MIPS Medicare Reimbursement program. There seems to be a lot of questions when it comes to that. So we are going to introduce our panelists, and I see one of our panelists has just run to the back for some reason, so maybe we'll skip Heather and we'll start at this side. We have Don Wechter. I was doing so good not to mispronounce that. So we have Don Wechter. He's a graduate of the University of South Florida with a degree in accounting. He is certified HIPAA security professional as well as certified in MACRA and MIPS. And he started many years as a CPA and eventually has developed his own consulting business, managing partners of healthcare compliance partners. And we appreciate all of the expertise that Don is bringing to the table with us today. We have Heather Miller in the middle. I've got to admit, I've known Heather for quite some time, and I was surprised at some of the new information in your bio. And perhaps she explains MACRA MIPS so eloquently and easy to understand because she's a special education teacher who went on to get her master's degree from Rollins, and so maybe we're all a little special when it comes to trying to figure out MACRA MIPS, and she does a really good job of explaining it. But of course, she does have 19 years of leadership experience in healthcare, operational management, organizational growth, and fiscal change management. She began at UCP of Central Florida as a director of the Pediatric Therapy Clinic, went on to go to NCG Medical as a provider advocate and implementation specialist. She works with over 450 accounts for NCG Medical, and all around a great person. So great to have you on the board, Heather. And then we also have Laura Sayun, and she has more than 20 years experience working in healthcare as a technology and revenue cycle consultant. She holds a bachelor's degree in health administration and multiple industry-specific certifications, including, and this is a whole lot of alphabet soup here, CPC, CPEHR, CPHIE, and CMQP. Her dedication of helping physician practices achieve and sustain patient satisfaction, practice efficiency, and profitability is unparalleled. She's a natural understanding of the challenges facing physicians today, and we certainly do appreciate Laura for joining us as well. So without any further ado, I will allow the panelists to start with their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Good morning, everybody. Hopefully made it through the traffic, the fun stuff to get here. But thank you for allowing us to come up here and share some of our knowledge with you to better understand the credentialing process. So we're kind of going to keep this an open discussion. We're going to jump back and forth. Each of us have kind of different parts. And hopefully we'll plug you guys for some good conversation and make this an exciting conversation. So Credentialing 101, and again, we're going to tag in on some of the 2017 billing hot topics while we've got your attention. So again, you've met the three of us. Thank you for letting us join. Little disclaimer, none of us are actually attorneys, so remember the presentation is for informational purposes, not at all to substitute legal advice. So just putting that disclaimer out there for you guys. Our agenda for this morning, first and foremost, we're just going to talk about credentialing versus contracting. There's always a little bit of confusion on what each one is, so we're going to walk through those definitions, make sure it's clearly understood the difference between the two. Then we're going to go through 10 simple steps of the process of contracting and credentialing, giving you some resources, some go-to tips, and various steps to make sure you're successful in that process. Then we'll get into hot topics for 2017, looking at billing updates, the fun MACRA MIPS program, all the HIPAA essentials you need to have on your radar for 2017, and then we'll get to some Q&A. Sound good? All right. So we'll get started with a little audience poll. So Laura's going to ask some questions so we kind of get an idea of who we're talking to and what your level of comfortableness is with credentialing.
How many people in the room have dealt with insurance companies to either credential or contract with them directly? And do you end up sometimes feeling like that when you work with insurance companies? Yeah, mine too. It's complicated from the payer side. There's a lot to figure out. Every payer is different, even though they always tell us that things are supposed to be uniform. They are absolutely not, and things change depending on what your specialty might be, whether you're a new provider, just having a new provider join your practice, or if you're changing the layout of your practice from in-network to out-of-network and looking at what might be beneficial for you. So hopefully when we go over some of the differences and some key tips, they'll be helpful. You will all get this slide deck, which will have links in it later, the actual PDF version of it, and it will link out to different payer websites and resources for you after the presentation.
That's correct.
So provider credentialing versus provider contracting. Credentialing is part of the contracting process, but oftentimes you'll hear people talk about this like they're one and the same, but they are different. Provider credentialing refers to the process of verifying the proven skills, training, and education of healthcare providers, verification of those provider credentials. And it's used both by healthcare facilities for new providers coming in, as well as insurance companies when you are registering with them and going through the credentialing and contracting process. CAQH, we'll talk a little bit about this one now, and then we'll hit on it again in a little while. CAQH is an organization and tool for insurance companies and healthcare organizations to pull data from in regards to physicians' information that's required for credentialing and contracting. It's a free resource, and many times the majority of the insurance companies are going to ask that you have a CAQH login and identifier prior to completing any processes with them. So it's one of the first things that I typically recommend you do when you're going to go through a process or have a provider, making sure that's updated and a resource that you use. So provider contracting is the actual process of requesting participation with a payer. You can choose to go in or out of network. You may say, I just want to register my provider with this payer, but I want to maintain an out-of-network status. The contracting part is saying that I want to be a provider within your network. I want to agree upon a rate with you, and I want to have a contract in place. So contracting is different than credentialing, and credentialing is the gathering of all the data, updating the insurances of who you are, and contracting is actually saying, I want something written with you, and let's negotiate some terms so I can see your patients and participate in your network. So the two different options when considering how you want to approach payers is, do I want to remain in or out of network? It may seem to everyone like, well, why wouldn't you want to go in network? Different specialties are going to have different preferences. You might have an acupuncture practice that wants to stay out of network, doesn't necessarily want to contract. There's sometimes that you don't have a choice because payers at the end can tell you that their panels are closed, which means you will operate as out of network. There are some things that you can do about that if you get that response from them, such as try and appeal, but in the end, they can tell you they don't have any openings in their panel for you. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a minute.
Right. So we're going to kind of move to these, how do I do this? So we're going to break it down to 10 easy steps. And again, as Laura's kind of explained at the beginning, there is a uniqueness to everybody's situation. But for purposes of today, we're just going to kind of go with the idea that this is a new doctor who's just come out and needs to set up his basically credentialing to be either in or out of network, whatever he decides to do. Obviously, there's always other parameters if that wasn't the situation. But for today, we're going to start like that. So the very first step, any new physician coming out, is to obtain an NPI, which is a National Provider Identifier, and complete the necessary documentation. There are websites. This is the website in which they can go to apply for this NPI number. This becomes their basically tag ID for rendering providership anywhere that they provide services, whether it's underneath their own organization or somebody else's organization. There are corporate NPIs also, which if you have a tax ID number and you're setting up your practice, you would actually apply for the corporate NPI for your corporation, and then you'd have an individual NPI to identify you as the rendering provider of the services. So again, the number one thing to do is they have to get these NPIs, ensure when they enroll that they are presenting themselves how they want the payments to flow, as well as how the structure of the business will be. So again, this link is a really quick and easy one. It's not a tedious process to get the NPI. It's just making sure you remember to do it.
One thing that we do encounter with the solo practitioners who operate with a tax ID is they will not understand that they need that corporate NPI, and many payers will absolutely require it. If you come to them and say, I have a tax ID, I'm practicing as LLC or whatever it is, if you're not a sole provider practicing with your social, you absolutely will need that corporate NPI. Medicare and Blues are typically the ones that will really push for those.
The type of documentation that they need to compile, the National Committee for Quality Assurance is kind of the standard QA guy out there determining what are these specific documents and information that a physician will need to obtain and have ready for anybody that they are hired by or in presenting their credentials. So this is just kind of a list of examples of what they say a potential payer might ask for. Again, every payer's credentialing process is unique, so you really don't know what they're going to ask for. So this is just a way to be prepared and have these items available upon hire or setting up your practice. Examples could be your education and training certificates, your board certification, your work history, malpractice coverage, just some of the examples that the guidelines have been set up and really will put you in a place of success if you have all of this ready before the credentialing process.
And all of those things you will need when you register with CAQH.
Which is step number 2.
Go ahead and do this. As I mentioned before, prior to reaching out to the insurance companies, you're going to have to for your commercials the majority of the time. When you go through it, it's really easy to use. It's pretty much like a wizard. You fill in the blanks, but you will need all of the information, your CVs, your malpractice insurance, your historical information for all your practice history. Once you have this, it's time to figure out who you want to go actually contract with. And part of the CAQH process is allowing people to pull your information from them. So once you have it set up, you have to select the payers that you're going to allow to see that, essentially saying they can, they can have access to it when I go through the process with them. It's really important on CAQH that you also attest and reattest regularly. They'll send you information to do so. If your information isn't current, payers will come back to you and state that you need to update.
Which leads to step 3, which is, again, the determination of what third-party payers would you want to contract with. And this is really where a practice looks at that market analysis and says, what and who is the population I'm serving? What are the ages I'm serving? What is the specialty that I provide? What are my top 4 insurances of my current caseload? Again, if it's a new practitioner, they probably don't know that because they don't have a caseload. Or if they haven't bought into a practice that already had an established caseload, they might need to go walk and do some research in their neighborhood and talk to other physicians and say, hey, what's a good plan? What's not a good plan? And really target those specific payers that you think would be advantageous to being in network with or out of network with. So just kind of get an idea of the pulse. One way is to run a report out of your practice management. You can actually see here, this is just an example of a little dashboard that'll show you what percentages of your current patients are under one insurance plans. So once you've done that, step 4 will be the collecting of the information about the contracting with particular insurance companies. So as we said before, each insurance company has their own process, their own application or their own steps. Underneath each of these, we gave you 4 examples. You can actually click on these when you get the PowerPoint, and it'll take you to their in-network contracting pages and lead you through their process. Some of them is a Q&A, and then you kind of navigate. Humana's is like an application. So each of them are very different. It's just going to be really making sure you understand what the requirements are for each payer. And then again, once you're connected with the database, you then tell the database and they'd be able to go pull that information and you're not having to send it out every single time.
There are some tricks too in knowing if your provider or your practice is going to remain out of network. You may not even have to start with the whole credentialing process. If you know some of the tricks with the different payers, you may just be able to send a fax with a letter with your information and a W-9, so you get registered in their database, and then you can process claims through them. So there's tricks to all of this and processes that are all different. You won't know that stuff just by seeing their websites, because they're going to walk you through and make you go through lots of different steps. So it really depends on what your end goal is. Tap into resources or people that might have some ideas of how to get around some things for you.
So that'll get us to step 5, initiating contact with the insurance companies. What you think might be easy, to get a contact name and a number and an email address and get somebody to communicate with you and talk back to you, is actually not so easy. So our biggest hint is you may need to go through this process several times before you receive an application. So this is where people get frustrated, because why? I'm going to apply. Why won't you let me in? Why won't you call me back? I don't know why they don't. So again, try every avenue. So you've got email, you've got phone, you've got, go to their Twitter sites. I don't know. I mean, anything you can do to communicate and get somebody to talk back to you. And don't think because they're not coming back, that means that you can't actually apply. It's just persistency and being in their face and getting out there and making sure, you establish that initial contact. So step 6 is going to be complete the application. You got the application, you know what's going on. Now you're going to make some copies, and you're going to have some follow-up questions, because just because you submit the application, you still need to be following up. You still need to be asking, what's the status of my application? How often are these applications approved? Do you have a board that has to review it? When do they meet? Questions like that, so you kind of have a nice pulse of how long this is going to take. Once approved, when should I expect to see my fee schedule and contract? And then how long will it be before I can actually start charging for my services? So again, all questions for you to kind of keep on the radar, because this is just an extension to the timeline of this process. And even getting into that, this is a process that could take up to 120 days at some point. So this is not a quick process, but the more you are in tune with the questions you need to ask, you can have some predictability of when you think this is going to be accomplished. Their board only meets once a quarter. Guess what? It's going to be, if you're at the first of the quarter or the end of a quarter, it might really affect that decision making. So just some key kind of questions you can use to keep you in check with it.
One recommendation on that as well is, if you don't have a reference number when you call an insurance company and a name of who you talk to, that call could have never happened. So write your history down, every phone call, the minute, the time. I know that seems just crazy, but you will call them and they will say, oh, well, we don't have that. Well, yes, you do. So from the moment that you even initiate it, that you look up what those steps are, write them down, document them, keep an Excel, whatever fits you best, if it's a notepad, but you need to keep them. Spoke to Julie on 2/24 at 10 a.m., reference number XYZ. Get your reference numbers. If you don't have it, it did not happen.
Good. Step 7 is going to be reviewing the terms and rates of the contract. So just like any contract you would sign, it's anything. This is an agreement of terms that you must know what you're signing. So reviewing this for all of its different components. Again, it's a legal document. You're signing it. Make sure you review it in detail. The next thing, and I think something a lot of people forget, is step 8, which is negotiate any objectable conditions. A lot of times the payers will say, here's your contract, sign it. Well, you have the option to negotiate terms. So if that fee schedule isn't something that's going to meet your reimbursement needs, negotiate it. So those are the type of things that you do have the ability to do, and go back and forth and make sure you get it to a fee schedule that you are happy with. Or if there's other terms in there that you think, well, I can't meet that, or it's not something feasible, you need to get it taken out. So you have all of those opportunities in this process. Sometimes the insurance company might not be that openly asking you to make those changes. So you need to kind of be that person to kind of put itself out there.
Also, know your worth. Know if you're providing a service in your community that other people are not offering, or that is only available at hospitals. You will be saving them money, because they obviously reimburse more in a facility setting. Know what you're going to be providing. Ask for carve-outs, things like that, if they give you a base fee schedule, and know what you're going to negotiate with. Why should they give you this change? You need to know all that before you go back to them.
Step 9, you got to sign it. Obviously, until a contract's signed, nothing is real. So you would need to know, again, who has signing power of your practice. Who is it? I mean, if you're a single provider, obviously that. If you're within a management company, obviously you've got to make sure the person signing the contract has the means to have that role in the process.
One thing on that as well is be very careful before you sign it to make sure your address, your zip codes, your MPI numbers, all of that fun stuff and what you provided them hasn't changed within the period in which they've waited to give you that signed contract. I've seen practices have their brand new buildings address changed by the post office, and we applied 5 months before. So by the time I got the contract, it was wrong information. Well, if I would have proceeded with that and tried to file claims, they would have all rejected anyways because the address was wrong. And once you do sign that and having to go back and update information after can be an additional lengthy period. As we all know, demographic changes are fun. So make sure all of your information is accurate, of course. I know that it sounds silly to say that, but it happens, and they're human on the other end, and they'll misspell and type things wrong, which will, in the long run, delay your reimbursement.
And then the last step 10 is keep your contracts on file for renewal and annual updating of fees. So like any contract, there's a renewal date. If you don't say anything, it automatically renews. When is it going to automatically renew? When do I have time to renegotiate? A lot of times you sign, and in that year you go, oh, wow, I missed that part. I need to make sure I renegotiate or update those terms upon renewal. So giving yourself those reminders of those expirations, whether it's in your Outlook, whether it's something that notifies you of when you need to have it on your radar to be prepared to keep these on file and accurate and into your advantage, in a sense, so that it's not just happening behind your back and you didn't even know.
You'd be very surprised, too, if you walked into a lot of existing physician practices and asked them if they knew where their contracts were, that they maybe signed 15, 20 years ago, that those are the things that magically grow legs and walk on out. It's important, in a lot of these smaller practices, we get very dependent on the one person that's there, and physicians don't really want to track paperwork around the office. That it's stored in a central location where other people know where this stuff is in case that person maybe decides to leave or retires, etc. And that you keep maybe a log, like Heather mentioned, when are the renewal dates for this specific contract? When am I allowed to approach them again in case I want to negotiate those fees? And when you do get a contract in your fee schedule, that should be built into your software. And periodically, either your billing managers, your admins, or whoever it is, should be comparing those rates and what your fee schedule is versus what you're being reimbursed. Insurance companies are not out there to be like, let me give you all my money, and they make errors. So you should be looking at that stuff, or your billing team should. It happens all the time.
So we're going to just kind of regroup a little bit here on this 10 steps and just talk about some tips for success. Number one, time is of the essence. You must begin this process as soon as the agreement is signed, as far as an employee agreement or you've decided to start practice, because this can take 90, 120 days, 180 days. I mean, that is not a quick process. Get organized. 3-ring binders for each provider credential, plus separate tabs for each of the different insurance payers in which you're applying for those contracts with. Keep them separate, keep them organized, and again, your success will be a lot better. Follow up, be persistent. We talked about that. Don't give up just because they're not calling you back. Call them back. Know your expiration dates. Set reminders so that you keep everything current. Renegotiate. You have the options to do it. You're in this contract. You're a part of it. You're a partner. You have the ability to do that. And then back up, back up, back up. Again, always have it on the back end. You have your resources. Know where they are. You're signing something that you're obligated to. There's some legalities to this. Know what your rights are and know what, you're responsible to be doing.
Our joke is that you're going to look like that.
So instead of this,
that, it's wishful thinking, but it's our own little fun joke for ourselves that we'll let you in on.
That's our goal, at least. You can send us it, via text. So that's really kind of the credentialing success tips we provide. 10 easy steps, right? If you do it the right way, they'll be nice and easy. We're going to move on to some hot topics unless you guys have any specific questions about that process or if we overstep something.
I actually have two questions. One, why am I telling an insurance company if I want to be out of network? And the second question is, if I'm in a practice with a bunch of other doctors, am I negotiating a separate contract than, say, the other doctor is, or wouldn't we all be on the same contract?
It depends on your relationship. So I'll take your first question. Why would I tell an insurance company if I want to be out of network? Providers that are out of network will file claims to insurance companies, collect co-insurance and deductibles from insurance or from the patient, and be reimbursed at an out-of-network rate, which is typically higher than what your in-network negotiated rates are. So in order for them to pay you, you have to tell them who you are. If you don't, they're never going to pay you. You can send them a claim all you want. While there is no contract start date and there is no negotiated fee schedule, they still have to know who you are, verify that you have a tax ID and those NPI numbers so that they can reimburse you. The second part of your question was if a provider is joining a group. It depends on that provider's relationship with the group. If you're just going in and practicing solely within that facility with all of the other providers, then you might have your own. If you are physically joining the group, there is a whole process that has to go into that as well when a new provider comes on. They have to be, one, enrolling the provider with the payer, depending on their specific steps, and then linking that new provider to that group. At that point, it would be the group contract that you're negotiating. Did I get it? Okay.
Any other questions?
We did
Okay.
good. Good questions. All right, so we're just going to kind of jump into some hot topics that are out there right now for 2017, along with obviously getting credentialed and being properly contracted for your reimbursements. There's other parameters that are out there that also affect, again, the bottom line of most practices, and that are important for you to keep on your radar, as well as the contracting and that. So we're going to talk first about some 2017 changes. We'll look at the MIPS program a little bit, and then we're going to look at your HIPAA security compliance that you need to have on your radar for 2017.
So we're going to start really briefly just about this because truly the 2017 changes that are hitting everybody is the MACRA and MIPS stuff. So I want to make sure that we get a lot of that information out to you. These are just some regular tips on an annual basis that people need to be looking at. We'll talk about the end of the ICD-10 grace period. This actually happened in October of last year, but from a consulting standpoint, it's unfortunate that when I walk into some offices, I'm still seeing high rejection rates for people using codes for ICD-10 that can no longer be used. When ICD-10 was first approved 2015, there was a 1-year grace period in which you could continue using unspecified codes. That all ended October of 2016. So rejection rates, if practices are not asking their billing department, what are we seeing in regards to rejections for ICD-10 codes, and trying to educate their staff and their providers about that. I know it seems silly, we're 6 months into this, but it's still happening. So it's something to look at. Remember that your codes change annually. You need to keep an eye on them. There might be opportunities to generate revenue for your practices. I also see when I walk in, you'll ask an office, where are your new coding books for the year? It's not something that people necessarily want to spend, especially in a small practice, money on. But you need those resources. You have to know what the CPT changes are. Their descriptions can change. They can be deleted, which they are. Physical therapy saw a bunch of new codes in regards to their evals and things. We saw a lot of changes in telehealth this year and some opportunities for chronic care management. Just know that that happens regularly. Apply to the listservs, especially CMS. Watch out. I realize that they're publications that are 1,500 pages long. Nobody really wants to go through all of that. But go find some resources online that you can sign up for email blogs. At least you'll get notified every once in a while so you can go get those, do some more research. We talked a little bit about telehealth changes. There was a new place of service code that was added for those services, place of service 2 that needs to go out with this existing modifiers. These are just new rules and how you need to bill. Happen all the time, may happen at the beginning part of the year, could happen in the middle depending on payer policies and things like that, so keep your eyes out. Modifier 25, as if it hasn't been under scrutiny for a very long time, is being looked at even more. That is used when providers do E&M services on the same day as another service. So there are descriptions, and if things aren't separately identifiable or for a different reason and times being used, insurance companies are going back and they're focusing heavily on these billing, and they may request records, they may put you in an audit for it. So make sure your documentation is accurate. They are going to be making some changes to global periods on several codes, so keep an eye out from that. And then the informal review for PQRS, there was some information that went out at the beginning part of the year that said, due to ICD-10, PQRS, people are going to be waived. And everybody mistakenly took this as, oh, I don't have to do it. That was incorrect. It was an issue within their system that they were fixing, but it did not mean that everybody had an out. So be careful when you see these things that you really look into them. Sort of leads us into the changes for PQRS and the meaningful use and all of that stuff. And one final thing that we have been seeing through consulting as well is that Medicare changed the way their EOBs come back now. It's nice because they now differentiate between the different program reductions that you are receiving, which I'm hoping that no one in here is. But what this has done from a technical side and with many software vendors is that it's created issues in how things post electronically. So make sure if you are someone that is using a software that when you post remittance, it's usually click it, many people just forget it after that, that your patient responsibility is actually accurately posting. We've seen several different software companies where it just posts fine, but the actual responsibility for the secondary and patient are not because of the changes that they made to the formats of not only the paper EOBs that you may receive, but the electronic remittance files as well.
And that'll kind of lead into the biggest change of 2017 was the passing of the MACRA, which is basically the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act of 2015. So our good acronym of MACRA. And you can kind of see here over the last, 10, 15 years, basically the Medicare reimbursement program was fee for service, and there was this SRG repel, and government would come in and say, oh, we're going to take it down. It got down to almost 29.5%. They were going to deduct from a Medicare reimbursement from physicians. And of course, the physician's going, are you crazy? And then, the government would come in and repeal it, and then it goes to the next year, and nothing was fixing it. They just kept putting it back on the books, and you can kind of see over time what it did. Well, finally, with the passing of MACRA, it took that away. And what we got was on April 4th of 2015, and this is a bipartisan passing. This isn't something that's going to change or go away now because we have a change in the presidency. This is basically, they repealed the highly criticized sustainable growth rate that had been on the table for quite a while. And it passed the MACRA, which is really creating a new pay-for-performance Medicare reimbursement program. So physicians are now going to be monitored and gaining points to then affect the way that they're being paid for their Medicare services. And many physicians are saying, well, how are you going to measure me? So the Quality Payment Program, or the QPP program, is what defines how Medicare is going to determine the actual scores for each of our physicians that are billing Medicare. This reporting for their performance started January 1st of 2017. So we're 6 months into the year, and this performance for this year is going to affect them financially in 2019. So there's a 2-year delay in which they gather the data, and then from that gathering, they will then give them a score that will then affect them financially. Now, this is starting in 2017, but it's projected for the next 5 years, and each year they're changing the way they'll obtain the score. So we're just going to focus on 2017 quickly and talk about the MIPS program, which is under MACRA and the QPP, and where the majority of physicians will fall and how they're going to be scored. So the government prior to MACRA had the Meaningful Use program, had the PQRS program, had the Value-Based Modifier program. They all ran parallel to each other. They all had their set of rules. They all had their own set of incentive and payment adjustments. And you had to do it, but you had to, you took them into chunks. Where now the government streamlined them and put them all under one program called MIPS. So you can see in this slide, the quality program is what they now call PQRS. Improvement activities is a new category under MIPS. Advancing care information is just meaningful use. It just replaces that. And then cost is the value-based modifier. So we have 4 new components in which there will be point values that they can obtain. So looking at the point values, we've got quality, in which a physician is going to have up to 60 points they can obtain. And they'll do that by reporting quality measures that are relevant to their specialty and their practice. The Advancing Care module, which is replacing meaningful use, is worth 100 points. Improvement activities is 40 points. And then the cost category is to be determined. For 2017, they decided to give it 0% weight because they weren't quite ready to pass it out. And to make the transition year a little easier, they said, we'll just take it off the radar. So for 2017, each of these different components are given a specific weight of the total score. So of the 60 points of quality, they'll pull in 60% of the total formula. And then you've got your 25% for your ACI, your 40 points get 15%, and then again, they zero-weighted the cost category. Projecting in 2018, they're going to bring costs back, and they're going to put it back on the table by taking 10% from quality and moving it over. So each year, we're going to kind of see these weights even out to where hopefully, in 5 years, each of the components will be equivalent at whether they keep it at 25% each or they give a specific weight. But these weights are how they're going to basically determine the overall score of a physician. So to not get into convoluted formula games, let's just talk about what this score means to a physician. So each physician is going to be given a performance score from 0 to 100. That's basically how it works. That equation at the end of the game will give them a point value of 0 to 100. On this scale, you see if a physician does nothing and gets 0 points, they will receive in 2017, or actually imposed in 2019, a 4% penalty. So if you don't play the game, you get penalized, 4% on your Medicare reimbursement. For 2017, they said, well, if you want to play a little bit, meaning let's just submit one measure, we'll give you 3 points, and with 3 points, you avoid penalty. Okay, great. But on the Physician Compare website, that physician's score, which will be published for anybody to go and see, will be a 3 instead of 100 or instead of a 95. So that score is going to be public knowledge. So in order to get down that line up into that 70 to 100 range, then you need to participate fully in the program by completing your quality measures, adopting an EHR, and proving that you're using it based on the Advancing Care objectives. And then you obtain those points, and they get you down to the end of the line where there is incentive money to where that 4% can be multiplied 2 to 3 times, potentially, depending upon how many people play or don't play. And then they've got this little extra bonus of $500 million for those exceptional performers in which they can tap in up to 10% additional. So you can go anywhere from a negative 4% penalty by doing nothing to potentially 22% incentive. And that's just in this year, because each year the negative goes higher, then the positive goes higher. So overall being is that physicians need to be in tune with their score. It's going to be public. It's going to affect their pay. And there are resources out there to help them get organized rather than reading a 2,600-page document and trying to understand that formula. But they're out there. So outside of all that fun stuff, HIPAA hasn't gone away either. So I'm going to allow Don now to have the mic and talk to you guys about very important HIPAA stuff because it's definitely just as imperative.
Great. So first let me reiterate my thanks for being here, as Heather and Laura already did. I'd also like to tell you a quick story. As Dorothy mentioned in the introduction, I've gone through macro MIPS certification myself. I did not tell you that, Laura, when you and I talked about a month ago about macro MIPS, but I had the opportunity to sit down with her for probably an hour and a half or maybe even 2 hours and really ask a lot of detailed questions because I'm just knowledgeable enough about macro and MIPS to be really dangerous and know the key questions to ask. I've had the opportunity over the last 6 years to work with hundreds of covered entities throughout the state of Florida and Southeast U.S. I worked with probably 24 meaningful use consultants and now macro MIPS consultants, and I can tell you, Heather and Laura, they're as good or better than anyone I've ever met. Their knowledge is not only very exceptionally deep, but their ability to explain the differences and their knowledge about how to qualify for maximum reimbursement incentives is very strong. And these are extremely large numbers that we're talking about for these healthcare practitioners. We're not talking about $5,000 or $100,000. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars or more, many tens of thousands of dollars or more, depending on the size of the practice, and getting a very good, highly qualified macro MIPS consultant is extremely important and pays for itself many times over. So thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And with the rest of the time, my time, I'm going to try to do a HIPAA 101 course, which I call HIPAA Essentials. It might be retitled HIPAA Bare Essentials now in the next few minutes, and just highlight a few key things that I'm seeing on an ongoing basis in my day-to-day activity with healthcare professionals. First, I'd like to open up with a quote. This comment was first mentioned to me by a surgeon client of mine here in Central Florida who really understood HIPAA. He understood HIPAA to the point that I asked him at one point, I said, you know, you can do a risk analysis yourself. This is a gentleman who graduated first in his class at Harvard Medical School, so he's not only extremely smart, but he did his HIPAA research. He said, his response to my comment was, yes, I know I can do a HIPAA security risk analysis myself. I've done the research, and that's why you're here, because I want an independent expert to confirm my understanding and add new light to what HIPAA is all about. And of course, he is one of my most frequent questioners in terms of, hey, how about this? How about that? Can I have cameras? Can I have microphones? Where can I put cameras and microphones? Where can I put them? He's constantly a resource for me to do research, which I then in turn share with my clients in their monthly newsletters. More recently, a comment almost identical to that was made by Ken Peach, who's sitting here in the audience. HIPAA is one of the greatest areas of risk to healthcare providers. Unfortunately, it's an area of very low attention and concern. So there's a big imbalance, which means if you're not paying a lot of attention to HIPAA and protecting that patient data, your practice, that these healthcare professionals practice, that they've worked years for, spent enormous amounts of money getting education for, can be wasted just by virtue of sheer sloppiness or not adequately paying attention to the law. Breaches are extremely expensive. They can not only cost a covered entity millions of dollars, they can in fact bankrupt them. I'll give you a quick example of 2 years ago. Physician owner of a clinic in Texas, meaningful use attestation. They sign off on meaningful use attestation. They get audited. CMS does an audit, says, oops, not only do you not qualify, but it looks like this is not just a violation, but an egregious violation. And when violations under HIPAA are egregious, they can be referred to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. Long story short, the physician was found guilty of violating HIPAA in an egregious manner by filing a fraudulent meaningful use attestation, which is a felony. He was sentenced to 11 years in jail and fined $2.5 million. So not paying attention to HIPAA, you can see, can not only be seriously damaging financially, it can be a career ender for a lot of people. So it's extremely important not to be afraid of it, but have a healthy amount of respect for it. All right, so we're going to talk about fundamentals of security risk analysis in a few bullet points, documents required to achieve compliance, and ongoing requirements to maintain compliance. Compliance and enforcement, a lot of people are concerned about HIPAA enforcement actions coming as a result of being audited. And that's the big scare tactic. Oh, be careful, if you get audited, you could be in a lot of trouble. That's absolutely true, but there's a much greater risk. The greater risk for being discovered for HIPAA violations is by having patients complain to HHS. HHS by law is required to investigate every single complaint that's filed with them. To date, they've had over 100,000 complaints filed. 6 of them are still pending. In cases, as I mentioned earlier, where there are complaints like that, the Office of Civil Rights is charged with the responsibility for enforcement action of HIPAA. They're the ones that can refer to the Department of Justice in cases of egregious violations, and have criminal penalties instituted. So the thing you need to be paying attention to is not only the threat of an audit, which might only be a few percent of healthcare practitioners getting audited. The greater threat is you have a patient that files a complaint. I can give you examples of my clients that it's happened to. I got the wrong medical records sent to me, and no, I'm not going to return it. I'm going to file a complaint with HHS. Really happened to one of my clients in Miami. So documents required are fundamentally, you got to have security risk analysis. Must be performed for every period that the covered entity is attesting for meaningful use or macro MIPS incentives. So at least on an annual basis, I have clients that, filed earlier this year for 2016. They're going to file again for 2017. We have to go back and review that security risk analysis and give them an update. That's one of the services we perform. Other documents that are often missed but required by law, a good high quality policy and procedure documents. Ours is about 250 plus or minus pages long, depending on the entity we're providing it for. A safety and security plan, an emergency mode operations plan, disaster recovery or contingency plan. Sometimes they're different, sometimes they're melded. We often meld them into one. You have to write out exactly the procedures that you go through in the event that all of your data is lost. Who do you contact? How do you access that information? Step-by-step written discussion of how that's done. You have to have a risk management plan. You have to have an incident response plan. Chuck, you and I had a conversation just recently about an incident response plan. What do you do when there's a misuse of patient data? Quick example, West Palm Beach, I have a client that practice manager got a phone call from a patient, and he said, Don, I think I got a problem. I don't know how big the issue is because it's only involving one record and one patient, hoping it's not a big issue. And I said, what's the issue? And he said, I just got a patient that complained that one of our staff members improperly accessed her record and then gossiped about it in the friend circle. And I said, that's a big problem. So what the incident response plan does is details anytime you have a misuse. I don't want to call it a breach yet because you don't know if it's a breach yet, but anytime there's a misuse or an alleged misuse of protected health information, you have to go through a whole series of steps. This document that we typically prepare is about 80 plus or minus pages, including a number of appendices that lists the step-by-step approach. But that is required under the law. Other ongoing requirements, risk analysis, of course, has to be done once a year if you're testing for meaningful use or macro MIPS incentives. You have to do remediate. You can't just look at the risk analysis and say, okay, I've got these gaps, but I had the risk analysis done, therefore let's put it away. You have to look at the recommendations, look at the gaps, what are the recommendations for remediation, and then document what you're doing in order to remediate those remaining open gaps. So if you get audited under meaningful use or macro MIPS, CMS is going to say, show us, first thing you're going to say, show us your security risk analysis. Second, show us what the gaps were. Third, what are you doing? What gaps have you remediated since this analysis was done? And what is your game plan for remediating the remaining open gaps? They don't require that you be 100% compliant because in reality almost nobody is. But they do require that you have the analysis done, the gaps identified, a plan for remediating the remaining open gaps that they're going to want to see. You have to review your system activity. You need to know who's been in and out of what patient records. That's a requirement under the law. You need to keep a log, an audit log, of those reviews. Our recommendation is that you review those audit logs once a week, stick a document in your HIPAA compliance file, acknowledging that you have in fact done that activity review. You have to do HIPAA staff training. You have to do privacy and security official training. So we have two training modules that we provide our clients. We have basic HIPAA 101, takes about 45 minutes to an hour. We have advanced HIPAA training, which includes a detailed comparison between HIPAA the federal law, and FIPA, F-I-P-A, Florida Information Protection Act, and the differences between those two laws and when either one of the two takes precedent over the other. You have to manage passwords. That's pretty fundamental, but believe it or not, I have a number of clients that on the first visit, they're not changing passwords on a regular basis. And in fact, some cases, they're not only not changing them, but they're sharing them, which is very, that's a big no-no. You have to do data backup. You have to test your backup and document that you can, in fact, retrieve that data in the event of emergency. I had a personal experience where I bought a computer. Supposedly a bunch of data was being stored in the cloud. I went back to the store a year later and said, show me how you can retrieve it, and they couldn't retrieve it. So you have to verify, not just store your information and back it up on a regular basis, but you have to have your provider demonstrate to you that they can retrieve that data. You have to do due diligence on your business associates. This is a huge risk for healthcare practitioners. I could tell you 20 stories right off the top of my head about the covered entity doing everything right, but somehow their business associate did something wrong. One of the most recent cases is Catholic Diocese of Philadelphia. They provide IT services as a service to a number of the nursing homes in the diocese. The IT guy goes in, downloads some patient data on his iPhone. It's not encrypted. He loses the iPhone or it's stolen. It's not encrypted. They have a breach that's reportable. Investigation ensues. And the diocese, not the nursing home, but the diocese got fined $700,000. There's never any allegation of harm done in these breach cases. If there was actual harm done to the patients, it would be much worse. This is just a fine for not doing things properly. And these fines have been, in the last 4 weeks, they're probably, I've read 3 or more, about $500,000 fines being assessed. So this is a regular occurrence. It doesn't just happen as a result of an audit. It happens as a result of a patient complaint. It happens as a result of a business associate of yours. I could tell you stories about people losing x-rays on the highway. They were taking them to the incinerator. Happened to a radiology group in Naples a couple years ago. They lost 800,000 x-rays out of the back of a truck on its way to the incinerator facility, and they had a breach. Who gets left holding the bag? The covered entity, not the business associate. Ultimately, it's a covered entity's responsibility. So you got to manage your business associates. You got to do a reasonable amount of due diligence to ensure that they are, in fact, HIPAA compliant. You have to have a media use, reuse, and disposal policy. So any kind of computer or equipment that you have to document what it is, who's using it, the purpose for its use, and anytime it's reused, you have to document that. And then incident responses, I deal with them all the time. In most cases, and I get phone calls, many a week. Oh, I had this incident. What do? I guide them to the incident response plan and the risk assessment form. I'm writing an article for Moroff right now. As a matter of fact, it's almost complete, Chuck, that talks about different kinds of risk assessments. One of them, under federal law, is a kind of risk assessment you have to do in the event that there's a misuse of patient data. You have a step-by-step process you're required to do by law. Hopefully, you will be able to conclude that there's a very low probability of harm to patients, and then put it away in your file and forget about it, but it needs to be documented. And to the extent you don't have it documented and you get an investigation from a complaint or former employee files a complaint, not just patient complaint, but former employee complains, then you can get in a lot of trouble. So as a final thought, I might just say that HIPAA compliance, as reiterating the initial thought, is an area that can pose a great deal of risk and liability to a covered entity. It's oftentimes given very low priority. I call this the Alfred E Newman approach to HIPAA compliance and risk management. It's like I had a client in Miami recently. We do review of their risk analyses of prior years for free, in case anyone's interested. I had one that came up that had 50 or more gaps identified, but the person that performed the analysis said you only need to remediate 2 because the other 48 are very low risk. that caused me to write an article in the newsletter about, the Alfred E Newman approach to security risk analysis, like blissful ignorance. I don't need to worry about this. Nothing's going to happen to me. Of course, then something does, and you have a catastrophe on your hands. So with that, that's my HIPAA 101 inside of a few minutes. If you have any questions, I'm available for any responses.
Let's give a quick round of applause to these guys. They've done a great job. Lots of good information. Please wait for the microphone to come to you when you have a question. We'd like to get it all captured on video. So who is first with their questions? We'll get to you right away this time.
Actually, I have sort of two questions. One is a HIPAA related and the other is maybe both, documentation. I think one of the challenging, I'm from a provider's office, and one of the most challenging things that I have and from my peers is that we have a list of policies and procedures and manuals and standard practices, but it's a list for documents and a list for this and a list for that and a manual for this and a manual for that. Could we take the information we have here and do like a deck of cards and put them together and say, this is a pretty A to Z list of documents and processes that we need to have documented, or are there more? That's something that it seems to be really hard for us as providers to get a handle on. Do these overlap? It would be a big help, even if it's a list of 50, to know that this is what we need to have. And that's question number one. And the other one is a specific HIPAA question. I was recently in a conversation with, not too specific, recently in a conversation with a provider or an entity that is declining to provide a note based, and their argument is on a need to know, that the end user who's asking for the note needs part of the information in the note, but they don't need it all. I mean, how do you have that argument when it's a regulatory thing? Someone's saying you have to send me your progress note, otherwise we're not going to pay, and this entity over here will not because they claim the end result doesn't have a need to know all the details.
Is this a payer-provider relationship? Like, is it a provider with a payer that they don't want to send it to, or a referring provider, or a patient?
The referring provider is in the middle. The referring provider is in the middle. Referring provider is referring to someone else for service, and the documentation may be held by someone else. So it's the top level. One is refusing to provide it to 3 because of a basis of need to know.
Can the patient get it?
No, it's not a situation that a patient could get it. I mean, they could, but it's not a realistic situation. And I don't know, I can't see how the entity, the physical entity, can refuse based on a need to know.
I'll take a shot at that. From a HIPAA standpoint, HIPAA requires not only that you maintain the integrity of that data and accuracy of the data, but they also require that you make it available for treatment, payment, and operations. So if another covered entity or a billing company, for example, says, I need to have this data in order to do my regular job, you are allowed to give that data up on a minimum necessary basis. So you don't have to give everything, the whole patient file, but if it's a legitimate request and it falls within that TPO, treatment, payment, and operations, then not only are you allowed to give it up, but you are in fact required to give it up. I have a client in Miami that happened to. The provider says, I'm not giving the patient record because it's a HIPAA violation. The fact is, it would be a HIPAA violation if you did not share that information. So that hopefully addresses the sharing of information. And the second, the original
first question.
from a documentation standpoint, what we recommend, I mean, you got, unfortunately, 1 million types of policies and procedures that covered entities have to follow. So what we do from a HIPAA standpoint is we do have a standalone book. We prefer to have a standalone book in the event of audit. It covers privacy and security rules and regulations. We can break them apart for some people that like to have them broken apart. But our starting point is this policy and procedure document that we think is fairly comprehensive from a HIPAA standpoint. It's, like I mentioned, 250 plus pages long. And then we sit down with the client and say, okay, what's unique to your practice that needs to be incorporated in this? Or if you prefer, what part of this is not at all pertinent to your practice, we can eliminate that. So the starting point is a very broad foundational document. From our standpoint, it's about 250 pages long. But we recommend you do that separate from OSHA and MACRA and other things, and just
One for each.
you have a shelf. You can either have an electronic shelf where these things are stored, or you can have a physical shelf in your office where you have ring binders. But we suggest keeping it separate just so you know right where to go for a HIPAA issue.
Is there a resource? Is there a resource that we can find? We need a HIPAA manual. We need a security risk manual. We need a policy and procedure manual for our employees. I mean, that's where we run, we get into the weeds of, we used to have a policy and procedure manual, and that covered us for everything. Now there's another manual and another manual and another manual, and we've gotten lost in the weeds. Everyone wants to be compliant, but they don't know. They don't know what they don't know.
Right, so if you go to the document slide that we went through from a HIPAA standpoint, we talked about documents. You need a security risk analysis. You need policies and procedures. You need a safety and security plan, emergency mode. All those documents we provide as a package. Anything outside that, we'd have to talk or we'd have to partner with another firm to provide you a more comprehensive package. But that gets into, okay, what do you specifically need and what are you looking for versus what's a standard package? And we can customize that working with other groups.
Don, thank you for the attributing that quote to me. I wish I could say it was mine. I think it was somebody else in here. Okay.
I thought I heard you say it.
No, but thank you. But in all fairness, someone else made it. But question, as we develop our community paramedicine program for Seminole County, where we will be, again, have a paramedic on the road for the next 3 years doing chronic care visits, my biggest issue right now, we have that individual working with us now to develop this during the month of May, is the information exchange, because we're going to be receiving referrals from the federally qualified health clinics and the free clinics in the community, seeing these patients, and then we're going to be providing information back. What I have suggested ideally is that our computer that this individual will be carrying around the county not have PHI on that computer, so that we'd use a cloud method to give us some protection on that. Is that a wise decision?
Yes, absolutely. So to the extent that you're not storing data, first of all, I would say any computer you carry around ought to be encrypted in the first place. But to the extent that you cannot store data on that computer, you have another level of security. So if it's lost or stolen, there's never a question about it. You have your IT person say, we have no issue because there's no data that's ever stored on that computer. We just access a cloud. Yeah, that's another higher level of security that you're correct on.
Any other questions? Okay.
Good morning. I'm Ken Graves. I'm with D&G General Contractor. As a general contractor with the HIPAA, I've been hearing about cameras and information being stolen from doctors' offices. A lot of the drawings are done through architects and designers. But as a contractor, is there some sort of direction or information I can get while I'm looking at the drawings to see where the cameras are posted or where the information is being laid out on the desk to be able to protect the doctor from somebody stealing the information?
I'll give you a short answer to that. The answer is yes, that anytime I do security risk analysis, I have to look at administrative safeguards, policies and procedures and things like that. I have to look at technical safeguards. Is your laptop encrypted? Things along those lines, passwords and security codes. I also have to look at physical safeguards. So part of what I do on all of my client visits, I do a walk around in the office to see physical security. So at a very base level, I'm looking to make sure that a notice of privacy practices is posted. I'm also looking, when it comes in your arena, is, okay, can I, from a common area, actually see any patient data? So from a contractor or construction standpoint, I'm looking at a front desk and entry area that is secure. There's separate doors that are buzzed to allow people access into the examining room area. I'm looking, and when I walk by on my way out that front desk, I'm looking to see if I can read any computer screens. So hopefully you've got a front desk that is high enough that those computer screens are back below. That's the most preferable. And I'm also looking at, is there any other mechanism where I can visibly see patient data or potentially see patient data just by a normal physical presence in the area? Anything, I'm looking for locks on doors. Anytime any kind of equipment room needs to have a lock on the door, things along those lines. So if I'm designing a building or constructing or remodeling a building especially, those are the kinds of things you want to look at. I could give you a more comprehensive list separately if you want.
I think we need to wrap this up. Thank you so much for your patience in us going a little bit over this morning. But this has been a great discussion. Thank you once again to everybody.
Thank you.